I think teams like Washington, Baltimore, Cincinnati, Buffalo, Kansas City theoretically have the best chance of beating them in a one-game scenario because they got better quarterbacks. Anthony, since it's your question, I'll let you ask the question.
Mr. Craig Hoffman, yes, I did propose a question to you. And off of the Deebo Samuel signing, how much closer is Washington to closing the gap between them and your Super Bowl champion Philadelphia Eagles?
Well, if I put out my handy calculator and type away frantically, I was like, do I do a sound effect down here? Do I do it? Afraid to hit too much on this keypad because that also controls the video, controls the number pad over here, so I can't do that wacky bit. Of course, we always just use our phones now as calculators. Hey Siri, can you open the calculator for me? It did. See, that's a.
Usually Siri responds, though.
I know. That's better for the radio show,
Yeah.
but it did fail me on the audio bit. And if I punch the cup, I don't know. There's no way to put a number percent on it. 2.7%.
Okay.
Here's what I would say. The Commanders are closer to the Eagles today than they were the day that they lost, based off their roster improvements, questions I think the Eagles have, and what I think will be hopefully more improvement year over year in Washington for a couple of pieces. But actually that one might wash out because Jalen Carter still just finding his own, is one of the best defensive tackles. Kenyon should continue to get better. DeJean, it feels like those guys can't get any better than how they played late in the year. But like those guys will continue to be more consistent and good and play at a high level. They have a bunch of young dudes, and I think those dudes will get better. That said, the Eagles are potentially losing Zach Bond, which would be an unbelievably enormous hit to their defense. He was so incredibly critical to what they did, and he obviously played individually at a damn near Defensive Player of the Year level. He was a nominee for the award. So I think they probably wind up figuring that out, but then what do they do on the defensive line next to Jalen Carter? Milton Williams is going to be a $20 million a year player, and if they re-sign Bond, I think it's probably going to cost them Williams. Then Mekhi Becton, he was a revelation at right guard. They had such incredible play from guys that were like $1 million players for them. And the Commanders, the same, by the way. There's a couple guys that were like $1 million, $5 million, whatever, cheap players that played at $10 million production. And that's what you have to do to win. Some of that's just from rookies, and their quarterback or their contracts are scaled that way. Sometimes you get lucky on the veteran market. But I think the biggest addition that either team has made so far is Deebo, obviously. And if he can provide some easy answers for Washington, and also, by the way, specifically against Philadelphia, you're going to have to break their defense a little bit. And Jaden figured out how to do that a little bit late in the season, that second game, and frankly, even in the NFC Championship game, and frankly, Pat Mahomes in the Super Bowl. Eventually was just like, F it, throw it deep. And it's hard because their coverage is really good, and defensively, they get after you. You don't have time to sit back. You kind of have to just take your drop and throw it out there, and if you miss, you miss, which is not exactly the way that anybody wants to play football, and it's especially not how the Commanders played last year, and it's especially not how Mahomes played last year. But if you can get a guy that can turn a 7-yard gain, a 7-yard slant, a 4-yard gain into a 50-yard gain, that's a total game changer. And so if Deebo becomes that, and I think that's the point that Logan made a great job of making on Take Command, is the Commanders, for as potent as they were, played in a way that feels unsustainable over time. The fact that they basically sustained it the entire year is crazy. But it did bite them in the NFC Championship game, right? Like if you got to go on 17, 18-play drives, you're probably going to fumble eventually. You're probably going to have a sack. You're probably going to have some other kind of turnover. And Washington got away with that almost the entire year, in part because their fourth down stuff was so good, so those drives looked a little different. They had an extra down in a lot of cases. And then Jaden was so fastidious with the football, you didn't have to worry about that. Well, now if you can take some of those 17-play drives and turn them into 7-play drives because you have an explosive play from Deebo in the middle without changing your play calls and without elevating your risk, that's a game changer. Have they done enough so far to catch Philadelphia? No, absolutely not. Are they going to be able to do enough to catch Philadelphia? Not unless Philadelphia loses all those dudes I think that we just talked about. But are they closer today? And do we expect them to get even closer with some of the improvements, hopefully internally? Can McCaffrey be better? Can Sinnott be better? Can some of the other guys, later round picks, be bigger contributors? Not to mention, can they upgrade a couple places in free agency in the draft? I hope so. But Philly's not going to sit pat and not get better too.
Yeah, I mean, so we see Deebo as an offensive, guy that's going to be able to elevate our offense. Is keeping pace with their offense sort of kind of going to be the best way to measure whether or not we've really made improvements or elevated the team to an extent?
I mean, it's part of it. I mean, I think that for a team as good as Philadelphia, you have to do it all, right? Like, you can't be like, hey, if we can just score with them, well, like, it's easier to score with them if you get more stops. That number's not as high. So it's got to be everything. And, that's another huge thing. Like, what does Lattimore, like, one of the biggest additions Washington can make this offseason is trading whatever version of Marshawn Lattimore they got last year for a good version of Marshawn Lattimore. And I'm not talking like 2018 All-Pro Marshawn Lattimore. I'm talking, can you play at a borderline Pro Bowl level? Maybe you don't make it. Maybe you're in consideration because you're on a good team. But, like, you don't need to be an All-Pro. You don't need to be one of the best 5 corners in football. Can you be one of the best 15? Can you not get in fights? Can you not give up 150 yards to A.J. Brown? And, like, if they can get a reliable corner, and that guy is Marshawn Lattimore, who's already on their team, but with a full offseason to get healthy, with a full offseason in the defense, with a full offseason for Joe Witt Jr. and Dan Quinn and their staff, Tommy Donatel, their DB's coach, to, like, understand Marshawn and how to best use him, and design the game plan like that from day one, design their defense for 2025 like that from game one, that's the biggest probably improvement they can make, unless they have one of these edge players fall to them in the draft that's like an instant day one game changer. If for some reason Shamar Stewart from Texas A&M or James Pierce from Tennessee falls to them at 29, and then that guy turns into Jared Verse, well, yeah, that's a total game changer on your defense. But the biggest probable game changer is just Marshawn Lattimore going from bad Marshawn Lattimore to good Marshawn Lattimore week in, week out. And if they can do that, then, like, they're a lot closer to Philly than they were last year.
Yeah, that's just the thing with Philly. And we talked about it all last season when we had to face Philly. They just don't have, a lot of chinks in the armor. So, every time you come at them, you literally got to have your best night. And that's really the only way forward.
Not only do they not have a lot of weak points, like they don't have those Achilles heels, like they're like iron fortified everywhere. I mean, their star power is crazy. They just got dudes everywhere, and that's the thing with Washington. Washington wasn't particularly weak anywhere last year. They just weren't overly strong anywhere either, and they just played out. Jaden elevated everyone, and they played at a high level.
Mm-hmm.
Dog, Philly's got goons everywhere. Goons compliment, goons positive, everywhere. And that's why, like, if Deebo can be even 2023 Deebo, a genuinely dangerous player, if Marshawn can be a genuinely dangerous player, if Terry is Terry, Jaden is Jaden, and you get, one or two more guys to elevate, now we're talking about a team that can compete with Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know that, Detroit at their best, they've got other stuff they got to figure out personnel-wise, and obviously how does the coaching go as they lose both coordinators. But, like, Detroit roster-wise is, like, the only team that I really see that can compete with Philly in the league. Everyone else is going to have some things go right. And I think teams like Washington, Baltimore, Cincinnati, Buffalo, Kansas City theoretically have the best chance of beating them in a one-game scenario because they got better quarterbacks.
Yeah. I think that's also why we just fell in the puncher's chance category, and that's sort of kind of like where we remain until, like, we make, a little bit more improvements or, we get a big name here or there.
And the other thing, too, is, like, what happens? The fact that they haven't re-signed anybody is interesting. I'm going to say that, and then we're going to go to commercial break, and they'll be like, breaking news, they re-signed Jeremy Chin on a 3-year deal or whatever, because that's always how that goes. But we just don't know enough about this roster to be – it's March 4th, right? The league year hasn't even started yet. Starts the 12th officially. The 10th is kind of, when the legal tampering period starts. And we'll start to get an idea. And hopefully in the next 6 days before the 10th, you get a couple of names that re-sign. But we don't have an idea of where the floor is right now because they haven't filled the holes, which actually leads beautifully into, we didn't plan it this way, but sometimes the show works out. It plans into the next thing I want to talk about, which is some of the narrative around how you build a roster. Like, we got this comment on YouTube that was like, what does the Deebo thing signing or Deebo trade do for signing a wide receiver 2, free agency or draft? That's a false choice. And I'm going to explain it to you next in a way that hopefully gets us to not have that question asked much more on the show. So we'll get into how rosters are actually built in the NFL ahead of the roster building season next here on the Team 980.
This is the Hoffman Show on the Team 980 and the Odyssey app.